first, I just want to talk about why I went to Iraq. I've talked with Robert a lot today about that, and I usually tend during my presentations and most of my writings to really focus on what's actually happening in Iraq, because I always feel that that's far more important than talking about my story. But in the context of what's going on in this country today, the fact politically that Iraq is a permanent situation now, and I'll talk a lot about that in a little while, but really just looking around, it kind of, the majority of the population kind of sleepwalking towards this imminent thing with Iran. And in that context, I want to talk about why I went to Iraq. And like Robert said, I was living in Alaska. I was totally comfortable working summers, doing volunteers for the National Park Service on Mount McKinley, and doing odd jobs during the off-climbing season, and living a pretty fun life. You know, I really didn't have any worries other than where should I go to climb the next mountain, and what route do we want to take, and that kind of thing. And I did start to become quite politicized around 2000, around the 2000 coup. And prior to that, I really, born and raised in Houston, and I went to school out of Texas A&M because that's where my brother went, and my dad, and several uncles, and a grandfather. And I got up to Alaska, and I started working for this fellow who, as a personal assistant, he's a quadriplegic man who was the State of Alaska Division of Vocational Rehabilitation Director. And he was a very political person, a blue blood Democrat. And I started working for him around 96, and this is really where my political education kind of began. And he basically, within the first 24 hours of working together, he said, so what are your politics? And I said, well, I guess I'm Republican. And he's like, oh, really? Well, what other policies do you like? What are the policies of the Democrats do you not like? Why are you not an independent? Why are you not a Green? And, I was just like, duh. I couldn't answer any of his questions whatsoever. I basically was completely ignorant, and, really didn't even know what it meant to call myself Republican or anything. And that really began my education. And so after working with him very regularly for the years leading up to what happened in 2000, by the time that happened, it was a big slap in the face to me, and kind of a wake-up call. And I became quite politicized and began to get quite politically active. And then 9/11, of course, and then the response against Afghanistan. And then when the drums to war started towards Iraq, I'd read enough and become educated enough to see that, I had read the PNAC and some of the things I'll talk about in a little bit as far as U.S. military doctrine and strategy, and that these plans had been in place for a long time. And then to sit there and watch this start to unfold, I felt, well, I need to really, I need to do something, because regular political activism in this country is really not doing the job. And I felt that really it's an information problem, because I had been reading the foreign news services and other individual writers in the Middle East at that time, and the reports I was seeing from, for example, Robert Fisk with The Independent and people like this, contrasted with what we were being shown on mainstream television. It was almost like two completely different stories, from the build-up to the invasion itself, and then to the beginnings of the occupation. And by then, I knew pretty clearly, once the invasion started, these people are getting away with this bogus policy based on lies and deceit and misrepresentations by essentially controlling all the information. So I felt, what can I do to try to combat that? And it was to go to Iraq and write the truth, simply. I did not go with any plans to be a journalist. I simply was going to go and write weblogs and send these back to an email list I had of 130 people. And so that's what I started to do. So I saved money. I through an indie media listserv in Beirut, I met someone who had been in there, and he said, go to this hotel in Amman. You can rent a car there into Baghdad, go to this hotel, and here's a couple of contacts. And so that's what I did. And fortunately, I went into Iraq the first time in November 2003 at a time when it was pretty doable to do that. I mean, it was certainly dangerous and risky, but it was nothing compared to the way the situation is now. So there was at least some room for error at that time. So that's essentially why and how I went in a nutshell. And since that time, I've ended up writing for a whole lot of different publications as a freelancer, and I've become a journalist. And it wasn't really my intention. It's just kind of what happened. And I continue doing that today because I feel that the need for real information coming out of places like Iraq or insert Middle Eastern country name here is so desperate. It's so dire at this point that the need is greater now than when I first went over there. So just with that frame, I hope that what I talked to you about tonight regarding Iraq will really get the wheels turning a bit about maybe some other ideas of what people can do to get real information out, because I still feel that is the problem going on in this country, that the corporate control of the big airwaves is really the problem, and it's really up to us as citizens to try to figure out what can we do to get better information out to people. So in that context, I want to start with, so I basically went to Iraq to try to get the real information out to more people in the United States. And so I want to start talking about Iraq by quoting the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Peter Pace, when on March 5th of this year on Meet the Press, he was asked how the situation was in Iraq. And he said, quote, I'd say things there, I'd say they are going well. I wouldn't put a great big smiley face on it, but I would say they're going very, very well from everything you look at, end quote. So I certainly have job security, but I want to talk to you first about what, quote, very, very well, end quote, looks like now in Iraq. As far as security, I think the most important issue at this time is the security, which basically anyone with a pulse at this point knows that the situation in Iraq now, as far as security, is absolutely horrendous. It's absolutely the most, or one of the most, if not the most dangerous place in the world, particularly Baghdad. And we start with the most important statistic of all that I'll throw at you tonight, and that is that well over 100,000 Iraqis have been killed as a direct result of the invasion and occupation. With that statistic, I like to go with the Lancet report. The Lancet is the most prestigious medical journal in the UK. Of course, this figure has come under fire from corporate media and people in the Bush administration. Bush prefers that 30,000 more or less famous quote that he said a little ways back. But the reality is that well over 100,000 Iraqis have been killed. And that study was released on October 29, 2004. So 100,000 is, I argue that that's far too low for several reasons. One, it's already grossly out of date. Two, so as not to skew the survey, they did not include areas of major combat operations like the Fallujahs and the Najafs. So that's several thousand people we can tack on right there. And then three, a friend of mine pointed this out. He read it, and then I urged me to go on and read the survey and how they did it. And another big reason that that's too low is that to do a survey like this, you have to have a baseline. And so the baseline, of course, naturally had to be prior to the invasion of Iraq. And so their baseline was the last 17 months of the sanctions. The sanctions where conservatively 500,000 children died from malnutrition and disease. Another 500,000 adults died. Sanctions that had been referred to by UN officials at that time as genocidal. And so that's the baseline of this survey. So I think that we can easily estimate that at least 150,000, if not 200,000, if not 250,000, have been killed. And I think that's the most important statistic of everything that I'll talk to you about tonight, have been killed as a result of this illegal invasion and occupation. And then the next most important statistic is how many U.S. soldiers have been killed. And as of me checking this afternoon, it was 2,416. roughly 10 times that number wounded. And when we talk about wounded, we don't mean just like a broken arm or a bruise. We mean permanent medical disability. The most common injury now that U.S. soldiers have coming home is permanent brain damage and sometimes brain death, because while they're in a Humvee going down the road and a roadside bomb detonates, they may have armor that will absorb the shock, but the concussion to their head, I've actually seen photos literally of just a chin strap because their helmet is blown off from the concussion. So technically they're alive, but the rest of their life they're going to be obviously on permanent medical disability. So this rate of soldiers dying of between 2.5 and 3 every single day is holding quite constant through the occupation. Another thing that's important to talk about is death squads. If you follow the news, that we see almost daily, or no, not almost, daily, there's scores of bodies turning up in Baghdad and sometimes other cities as well, where the most common way these bodies turn up is they have their hands cuffed behind them and anywhere between 2 and 10 bullets in the head. The morgues are literally overflowing. I've been writing about this a lot lately, using my sources in there, who a couple of them have managed to go by the Baghdad morgue, and the most recent estimate is 85 bodies a day are turning up in the Baghdad morgue. They can hold 90, and then they can only hold them for 15 days, and then they transfer them to a cemetery administration, who then has the responsibility of burying these bodies. They can only hold 90, so when they max out on their refrigerators, they have 3 refrigerator trucks they can bring in and set in the courtyard to hold some of the overflow. But that just gives you a rough idea of what it looks like in Baghdad today. There's what they call floating checkpoints popping up from time to time, run by supposed Iraqi police or Iraqi National Guard, and people don't really know if these people are who they say they are, or are they working for the Badr militia or the Mahdi army or a Sunni militia. And so as a result of that, an average of 30 Iraqis a day are being kidnapped as well. And that's the most conservative figure that I can find on that. As far as infrastructure, we talk about electricity now. Basically, it's safe to say on almost every level of the basic infrastructure, it's notably worse now than it was prior to the invasion. So again, we're comparing it to the glorious time of the sanctions. But electricity now, the average home in Iraq has 3.2 hours of electricity per day. And I think that's an old statistic. I think it's from reports I've been getting from people in Baghdad, down in the south, in as far south as Basra, as well as including the northern region of Kurdistan. I think 3.2 is too low. I think we should look for an amended figure for that to be notably lower even now. So 3.2, for example, I know in some areas of Baghdad now that's about 1. The average in the last couple of weeks has fallen down to 1. As far as water, potable water remains in short supply in Iraq. It's really, there's ongoing water shortages even in the capital city. And as far back as January 2004, I actually did a trip to report on a little bit of what's happening with the water situation, because I did a report on Bechtel. It was under their jurisdiction of their contract that it was their responsibility to rehabilitate several of the water treatment plants in Iraq. And I went to 3 that were noted in their contract in Hilla, Najaf, and Diwaniyah. And I interviewed either the head engineer or the assistant engineer at each of these places. And the best case scenario I found was one of the engineers said, yes, some people from Bechtel came by and they replaced some of the sand filters that we have, but that doesn't actually produce any more potable water. And then the other 2 places essentially said, the engineers told me, Bechtel who? There's a result of that. It's common knowledge now for anyone who really reads some of the decent news coming out of there from decent news sources, I should say, that the corporate rip-offs at this point are just really off the charts. And Bechtel, just for example, they've been awarded a minimum of $3.8 billion of contracts, which we're paying for. And their initial contract of $680 million, they have already been paid off in full for that. They're cost plus, fixed fee, no bid contracts, which means they're guaranteed a profit no matter what happens. If you're a corporation, this is the kind of contract you want to get. And so what that looks like on the ground in Iraq with no oversight is billions and billions and billions of dollars are just literally missing. Last I checked, it was $7 billion of that the U.S. was supposed to be in control of is quote unquote unaccounted for. This is one of the main reasons, this and the security situation, of why the infrastructure in Iraq looks the way it does today. The last thing I want to talk about regards to that is the healthcare situation, because I've done a quite extensive report on the situation of the health situation there in regards to hospitals. And again, if we look back to, say, the early to mid-'80s, before the Iran-Iraq war, and then even in the first few years of that war, before that really started to eat into the Iraqi infrastructure, Iraq had the best healthcare system in the Middle East, socialized health system where Saddam went to great lengths to send doctors abroad and bring them back. So they had a very sophisticated and good health system compared to other countries in that region. But now that's degraded to a point where even, again, compared to during the sanctions, there was a recent report that came out, I believe this past November, that child malnutrition is double now what it was even during the sanctions. And also a report that came out by some doctors in Iraq found that if you go into a hospital now in Baghdad, you have an 80% chance of leaving that hospital with an infectious disease that you did not have when you went in. Many people are too afraid to go into hospitals to get treated. And then, of course, that's coupled with the usual brain drain that occurs in war situations where doctors and academics and other professionals are leaving because the security situation is so bad that, of course, with kidnapping being the crime of choice now, professionals are prime targets because, of course, more can be extorted from their families. So that, of course, factors into a healthcare system where we have younger doctors, some who haven't even finished medical school, are now having to step into these shoes of senior doctors who've had to flee the country for their own safety. And that, of course, compounds into everything I just talked about. So with all of that, just that very brief overview of the situation on the ground there, let's hear this again. I'd say they're going well. I wouldn't put a great big smiley face on it, but I would say they're going very, very well from everything that you look at. Another thing I want to talk about tonight is the rampant amount of war crimes that are being committed in Iraq. And some of this might sound, even to those of you who've read a lot of the more accurate news sources coming out of Iraq, but some of it may sound a bit outlandish. But the reality is the situation on Iraq, I think that it is comparable to what happened in Vietnam if we, of course, adjust the numbers. We don't have near the number of troops in Iraq as there were in Vietnam. But if we look at what's happening there on a daily basis, and I'll give you some very specific examples, it's a no-win situation. It's a guerrilla war. The U.S. military is completely bogged down. There's numerous problems we can cite as to why this is happening, but it has degraded back down into what is referred to as an atrocity-generating situation. And I think it's really important to talk about war crimes because despite the fact that this administration has made light of the Geneva Conventions, if you pay attention to media in other countries, the U.S. is committing one war crime after another in Iraq and violating international law and completely disregarding it. And I think it's important that people here know so that when that, something like 9/11 happens and people are, well, why do they hate us? And now we have this catastrophe in Iraq and the level of anti-American sentiment, of course, in that country, but now throughout the Middle East is going through the roof. And when I talk about this, I think you'll understand why. Because despite the fact that our corporate media will not report what's happening in Iraq, and especially the atrocities, does not mean that it's not being reported in the Middle East. On the opposite, it's being reported very, very heavily in the Middle East. And so there's this huge disconnect between what people see here and what everyone else is seeing over in the Middle East and even in much of Europe. But I want to cover a few few of the areas of war crimes that are happening in Iraq, because the broad charge against the Bush administration in Iraq is that their conduct, their deployment of military forces, and their treatment of civilians and prisoners has been excessive and indiscriminate. This is in violation, of course, of the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions. So first I want to talk about collective punishment and the deliberate targeting of civilians. I've seen this firsthand in Fallujah. I was in there in April 2004 during the first siege, which was quite a light siege compared to what followed it in November. But myself and a couple of other people, including Rahul, who's here tonight, went into Fallujah in a bus carrying humanitarian supplies, and we went and spent the night at a small clinic there. And we watched, for hours, we watched mostly women and children, some men, being brought in, all saying the same thing. They all had gunshot wounds, and they were all saying the same thing, that they were all being shot in or near their homes by U.S. military snipers. So either it was a citywide conspiratorial lie, or U.S. Marines were sniping anything that moved in the city. And when I went back in May for 3 more visits, that's what I found when I interviewed doctors and other civilians from all around the city. And this is a policy that we've now seen repeated throughout Iraq during the major operations. But this is, of course, a gross violation of the Geneva Conventions, deliberately targeting civilians, because the U.S. caused actions to be taken in Fallujah, which violated the laws of war. The targeting of civilians and children and women by snipers, the deliberate targeting of ambulances as well. We saw this also when we were in there. Placement of snipers on the roofs of hospitals and prevention of civilians from getting there for medical attention that they needed. According to Article 48 of the Geneva Conventions, on the basic rule regarding the protection of the civilian population, it says, quote, "In order to ensure respect for and protection of the civilian population and civilian objects, the parties to the conflict shall at all times distinguish between the civilian population and combatants and between civilian objects and military objectives, and accordingly shall direct their operations only against military objectives." Another provision of that same convention says that the civilian population as such, as well as individual civilians, shall not be the object of attack. Acts or threats of violence, the primary purpose of which is to spread terror among the civilian population, are prohibited. Of course, it also makes very clear, it says indiscriminate attacks are prohibited. And this is what myself and several colleagues witnessed firsthand. For example, especially on that last part, indiscriminate attacks being prohibited, during the November siege of Fallujah in 2004, the U.S. military declared the entire city, a city of over 350,000 people, a free fire zone. This means basically, in translating that free fire zone, well, it basically speaks for itself, but it means that anything that moves in the city is a legitimate target. So because of that, according to sources in Fallujah, doctors and people working for an Iraqi NGO, that between 4,000 and 6,000 people in that city were killed during the November siege of Fallujah. It should also be noted that approximately 70% of that city, the entire city, was destroyed, homes made unlivable, and some entire neighborhoods even bombed to the ground during the U.S. assault on that city in November. This happened on a more minor scale in April, but in November, basically, they pulled the gloves off. Another war crime worthy of mention here is that water, food, and medical aid were cut off from Fallujah both before and during the siege of that city. This form of collective punishment I've also seen firsthand in both Ramadi and Samarra, and it even led the UN to declare in October of 2005, quote, "The U.S.-led coalition's alleged practice of cutting off food and water to force Iraqi civilians to flee before attacks on insurgent strongholds is a flagrant violation of international law." Excuse me. Gene Ziegler, the UN Special Reporter on the Right to Food, said, "The action is inhumane and causes innocent people to suffer. The Geneva Conventions on Warfare which form the basis of international humanitarian law, not only forbid denying food to civilians, but actually make the occupying force responsible to provide it. This is a flagrant violation of international law. So either in part or in full, these policies have been utilized in Fallujah, obviously, as well as Ramadi, Samarra, Haditha, Al-Qaim, Balad, Abu Hishma, Saniya, Najaf, Kut, Baghdad, Mosul, to name a few. Illegal weapons. This is a subject that is shied away from quite persistently and consistently by the corporate media, but all of these are, of course, violations of the Geneva Conventions. The fact that cluster bombs, uranium munitions, white phosphorus, and fuel air bombs have, and some of these are still being used in Iraq. According to Protocol 1, Section 1 of the Geneva Conventions, which applies to the methods and means of warfare, Article 35 says, quote, "In any armed conflict, the rights of the parties to the conflict to choose methods or means of warfare is not unlimited. It is prohibited to employ weapons, projectiles, and material and methods of warfare of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering." One example of this that I covered when I was in Iraq, again, if we go back to the November 04 siege of Fallujah, was it was impossible to get into the city at that time because the military essentially set up a very draconian security ring around there. And to this day, for example, anyone going in and out of the city has to get a retina scan and all 10 fingers fingerprinted, and then they're given a barcode that identifies them as a citizen of Fallujah. But during the siege, the military did its best to keep journalists out of the city, and they were almost 100%. Excuse me. But how I covered the siege was in Baghdad, there was this massive influx of refugees coming into the city, and sometimes even doctors from Fallujah. And I was going to the different camps around the capital city and interviewing people about what was happening, why did they leave, what did you see when you left, this sort of thing. And consistently, what I was hearing was very, very vivid descriptions of, at the time, what I thought was napalm. People were talking about seeing these bombs being dropped that would explode and fire spread everywhere, and anytime anyone got any of the fire on them, it would burn down to their bone, that putting water on it didn't work, and it was used enough that people figured out that if they put damp mud on it, that would basically eventually extinguish the fire. I was hearing this from several refugees and many of the doctors as well. One doctor who described for me very vividly said, yes, I was a doctor in the Iran-Iraq War. We had these weapons used against our troops during that war, and I treated them, and I know exactly what this is. And I didn't know at the time it was white phosphorus. I just referred to it as a strange weapon or an incendiary weapon. And then ironically, the media being the strange beast that it is, it took that story. I reported it on Democracy Now! I wrote a story for it for an internet news site called Interpress Service, but it basically died. It was reported in Arab media some, and then just this past October, early November, Rai Television in Italy ran a documentary, not the best journalism I've ever seen by any stretch, but it ran a documentary about illegal weapons being used in Fallujah. And that essentially reopened the door on this whole topic that essentially was closed for a while. And what happened was basically the Independent newspaper in the UK started to run they were doing a lot of investigation on this, and they contacted me, and I rewrote some of my information, and we ran that. And then they ran another story, and it of course, the first official response from the Pentagon here in the U.S. was flat out denials. No, we didn't use any illegal weapons. We certainly didn't use any incendiary weapons or anything like this. And then some U.S. soldiers popped up and started talking about, oh yeah, we were there. We called it Whiskey Pete over the radio, and we stepped over the charred bodies. And so the Pentagon eventually said, well, we used it, but only for illumination purposes. And then some more, and most of this information, the Independent did a hell of a job really staying on this story. And then they found a military field manual written about what happened during the siege, where there it was in print of soldiers talking about using white phosphorus. So then the Pentagon's next response was, well, we did use white phosphorus, but only against fighters. And then even more information was produced, and then so eventually they were forced to say, we did use it against fighters, but it could have hit civilians also. So that's just one example of one story that actually did see the light of day. Of course, if we talk about cluster bombs and uranium munitions, for the most part, those haven't gotten that much exposure. But these types of weapons are still being used, specifically cluster bombs and uranium munitions and white phosphorus. All three of those are still being used in Iraq today, and all of them violate the Geneva Conventions. Another important thing to talk about in regards to ongoing violations of international law is I alluded to it some earlier, is the impeding of the medical system. This is essentially safeguarding civilians in the medical systems are essentially what the Geneva Conventions were. That's what brought them into being, basically. And I want to talk about the fact that the U.S. military took over Fallujah General Hospital on 7 November 2004. It was the first thing they did before they launched the actual siege of that city, because they wanted to control the information coming out. They did not want journalists going in, interviewing doctors like what I had done during April and a few other colleagues had done, and getting that information out. So they justified it as saying that the hospital was a, quote, center of propaganda that spread rumors of civilian casualties during the previous assault in April. So during the siege in November, this time they went into the general hospital. They didn't mess around. And there's photographs of this where patients and doctors both were rounded up, their hands tied behind their backs, and ordered to lie on the ground, which is, of course, a war crime. 2 days later, the U.S. bombed Fallujah's Central Health Center, another war crime, which killed 20 nurses and doctors and an uncounted number of patients. The U.S. military refused to allow emergency aid to be brought into Fallujah, a war crime. The U.S. has also refused to allow doctors to evacuate wounded people to hospitals outside the city, also a war crime. Attacks on civilian hospitals are grave breaches under Article 147 of the Fourth Geneva Convention in 1949. An attack on even a military hospital is a grave breach of the provisions of Geneva Convention 1. So the Bush administration has openly defied the Geneva Conventions and continues to do so to this day with absolutely no statements of remorse. So think about what that's doing to levels of anti-American sentiment in Iraq and around the entire Middle East, as well as, of course, the reputation of the U.S. Another interesting facet I want to talk about is the level of control that has been exerted over the media in Iraq. Independent journalists who have tried to cover Fallujah and other places at this point have been detained and shot at by U.S. forces, which is, of course, a war crime. A specific example I like to share is a U.S. order issued on March 2004 gives the U.S.-installed Iraqi government sweeping powers to control the media. At that time, Prime Minister Ayad Alawi, who's CIA, in November of 2004, issued a letter telling the news media to, quote, stick to the government line on the U.S.-led offensive in Fallujah or face legal action. So that's free speech in Iraq. Collective punishment. The first thing that U.S. forces did in Fallujah, and I've seen them do in Ramadi, Fallujah, and other places, is when they're going to launch an operation, is cut off the water supply and the electricity. This is, of course, is a war crime. For example, in Fallujah alone, for a month after this, women and children and their families who were trapped in their houses by curfews and snipers went without food, water, medical care, or electricity for at least a month. U.S. forces left Fallujah's families to face this scourge without providing electricity, sewage, or other necessary services. All of these are war crimes. Of course, there's torture. This has been going on since almost the very beginning of the occupation and continues to this day. Actually, just this week, just in the last couple of days, Amnesty International released a new report citing more instances of torture and showing that the orders for this go at the very least as high as the Secretary of Defense, and it could be argued that they go higher than the chain of command than that. But it's just important to note that not only in Iraq, but of course Afghanistan and Guantanamo Bay, this sort of thing is happening daily. Everyone there knows it. Just because we're not being told about it back here does not mean that this is happening. The last thing I want to talk about regarding war crimes is media complicity. I went to a World Tribunal on Iraq in Rome, Italy in February of 2005 that focused on what was the media's role in allowing the situation in Iraq to happen, as well as continuing to this day to cover up what keeps happening there. And what I learned there is that there's specific aspects of the Nuremberg tribunals and as well as the UNESCO Charter for Journalism that specifically address the media's role in wartime. And according to both of those, the most important role for the media, or the most important duty for the media during war, is not to incite the public to violence. And if we look at the U.S. corporate media back up to before the war, the selling of the war, basically not questioning the powers that be, give us the proof that you know that there's WMDs there, give us the proof to the links between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein. And then not only that, but essentially demonizing the entire country, whereas if you watch the media, you thought there was this country called Iraq and there's just one big guy there, Saddam Hussein, and that's it. There was no people. We weren't shown what did life look like there, what did Iraqis think about this, what did they want to see happen. Instead, we saw this total demonization of an entire country and really a justification given for the powers that be to go to war. And I think that's a blatant violation of both the Nuremberg Charter for Journalism and the UNESCO Charter for Journalism. So we could look at outlets like CNN, Fox, and stenographers such as Thomas Friedman and Judith Miller of the New York Times, and talking heads such as Bill O'Reilly and Rush Limbaugh, and see that they're certainly guilty of inciting the public to violence and aiding and abetting in war crimes and crimes against humanity, for arguing that the U.S. violate the law by invading Iraq and now occupying it, and made essentially, by doing so, they made all the aforementioned war crimes that I've discussed possible. That essentially none of this would have happened had the media, I think it's arguable of course, but would any of this have happened had the media truly done its job as far as questioning this administration? Why are you going to go in there, show us the facts, prove it to us, and then not only that, but continuing to cover it up as they've done as long as the occupation's gone on. Because really, invading a country is really, as an act of aggression and not out of defense, is really the mother of all war crimes. And so much so that even on September 4 of last year, the BBC even reported that Kofi Annan told them that the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq was an illegal act that contravened the UN Charter. Of course, we didn't hear too much of that back over here. The last thing that I want to talk about really in detail is future U.S. plans in Iraq. I think it's really important that people here understand what's going on the ground regarding the so-called embassy and permanent U.S. military bases there. I think this administration very much wants to withdraw some troops from Iraq. I'm sure they would love to get it down to a number like we have in Afghanistan, which is, I think, roughly 30,000. Certainly less than 130, which is roughly what's there right now. Certainly a nice troop drawdown prior to the November elections would certainly benefit them. But we don't have any willingness of the Bush administration to talk about a timetable for withdrawal, because they have no plans for a total withdrawal ever. Let's start with the embassy, in quotes. It's being built right now as we speak. There's actually been some press attention on this just in the last week, primarily the Times out of London, not anything over here. But it's a $592 million contract that was given to a very corrupt Kuwaiti company. It's being constructed right in the middle of the so-called green zone in central Baghdad. There's 21 buildings. The walls are reinforced 2.5 times their normal standards to be able to withstand bombardment. And it's going to have room for over 8,000 quote-unquote government officials to work there. It has a gym. It will have the largest swimming pool in Iraq, a barber and beauty shops, a cinema with first-run movies, a food court, and commissary. There'll be a large-scale barracks for troops, a school, locker rooms, a warehouse, a vehicle maintenance garage, 6 apartment buildings with 619 one-bedroom units. The site, when it's finished, will be 2/3 the area of the National Mall in Washington, D.C. So unlike Iraq's infrastructure, this one is coming off right on time. And you can imagine the sentiment of Iraqis on the street with 1 to 2 hours of electricity per day, looking across the Tigris River at the green zone. There's big cranes. They're well aware of what's being built there and who's building it. It's not Iraqis, it's imported workers, of course. So that's the U.S. embassy that's being constructed right now. Just to give you an idea of some of the bases, I want to talk about one called Camp Anaconda in Balad. Balad is not too far outside of Baghdad. Camp Anaconda, there's 20,000 soldiers there. Less than 1,000 ever leave the base. There's 2 base exchanges. They sell the latest tech gear, televisions, iPods, CDs, this kind of thing. One of the managers of one of these recently talked about, he was proud of the fact that he was selling about 15 televisions per day on average to U.S. soldiers. There were plans for air-conditioned troop quarters there, for them also to get internet, cable, and overseas phones in the troop quarters. And there's thousands of civilian contractors at these bases. At this one in particular, there's enough there, well over 1,000, that they have their own living quarters area that they call KBR land, Kellogg, Brown and Root. There's a large hospital there where this gives you an idea of how many troops are being wounded in Iraq. On average, 400 surgeries a month are being performed on injured U.S. soldiers. That's just in this one base. So it's pretty easy to do the math on that. Air Force officials claim that the runway there at Balad, it is an air base, is one of the busiest in the world. They claim that it's the second busiest in the world behind Chicago. The base has over 250 aircraft of its own. And to give you an idea of the meals being served there, of course, Kellogg, Brown and Root is in charge of base support and the meals and all of this and staffing. And they're served by what are called third country nationals, which is essentially slave labor. They're going and taking people from countries like Sri Lanka and Nepal, for example, and employing them in these bases and paying them very, very low wages. But they do serve very lavish meals. For example, in the past, in wars, soldiers knew that they would go and probably lose weight. Well, now on the average tour in Iraq, soldiers are gaining weight, and it's because they go to these cafeterias, and rather than soldiers doing PK and the cooking and this sort of thing, it's hired out to private contractors. So they are being served extremely lavish meals, turkey dinners, many choices, every meal of what you want to eat. But if they don't want those meals, on this base alone, there's a 24-hour Burger King, a Pizza Hut, a Popeyes, Subway, and then a Starbucks also. There's also a very large swimming pool at this base as well, a first-run movie theater, and a Hertz rental car agency. The base is so big that people can go rent a car. Of course, the maximum speed limit's 10 miles an hour, but I guess for thrills, they can rent a car and just drive around on the roads inside the base. So just a few companies to keep in mind. Several other gigantic bases like Camp Anaconda are in Iraq. Another example that I'll touch on briefly is Camp Victory near the Baghdad airport. This one I'm not real sure if it's 1 or 2 bases, because there's Camp Victory and then there's Camp Victory North, and they border one another. I want to preface this with there's kind of one joke I've heard is that there's 2 man-made structures visible from space: the Great Wall of China and Camp Bondsteel in Kosovo. Camp Bondsteel is a U.S. base there that up until Iraq was the biggest U.S. military installation outside of the U.S. Now in Iraq, Camp Victory is twice the size of Camp Bondsteel, for example, and you can find photos of this online, but there's even a U.S. soldier that did his own Ironman triathlon within Camp Victory, which means you run a marathon, you bike 140-something miles, and swim a sick number of laps in a pool. But so they're big enough for him to do that just within this one individual base. And there's at least 6 bases of this ilk in Iraq. 6 is the bottom line lowest number. It could be notably higher than that. Some people estimate 12. But the bottom line is there's permanent military bases in Iraq being constructed and augmented as we speak. Excuse me, as well as the so-called embassy. So there's no timetable from the Bush administration. Why? Even a surprising report that came out in the not so esteemed New York Times on April 19, 2003. So we're looking at roughly 10 days after the fall of Baghdad. This report came out that said military officials have said, quote, "There will probably never be an announcement of permanent stationing of troops in Iraq. Not permanent basing, but permanent access is all that is required," according to these military officials. And we should note also that this was written into the Iraqi constitution, not a clause saying we will have direct access to these bases in Iraq, but it was written into this constitution, which was written in English and then translated into Arabic, I should add, that a foreign power, it was not disallowed for a foreign power to have access to these bases that are in Iraq. So essentially, it essentially has been manufactured from the very beginning for it to look this way. Another clue, the 2002 National Security Strategy. I want to just quote you a little bit of this. "Our forces will be strong enough to dissuade potential adversaries from pursuing a military buildup in hopes of surpassing or equaling the power of the United States. To accomplish this, the U.S. will require bases and stations within and beyond Western Europe and Northeast Asia." So U.S. policymakers have effectively replaced the Cold War with the long war for global empire and unchallenged military hegemony. And here's another clue. There's another military document. Some of you may or may not have heard of this. It's called Joint Vision 2020, as in the year 2020. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff vision here is, and I want to quote this, "Dedicated individuals and innovative organizations transforming the joint force of the 21st century to achieve full spectrum dominance," they have that in bold type, "persuasive in peace, decisive in war, preeminent in any form of conflict." That last bit's in italics. So I want to spell it out really clear to conclude. Another Defense Department report called the Quadrennial Defense Review Report, which came out just on February 6th of this year. And I want to read you a little bit of this, where it says there's a stated ambition to fight, quote, "multiple overlapping wars," which we have now, and to, quote, "ensure that all major and emerging powers are integrated as constructive actors and stakeholders into the international system." So I want to read that again. I mean, we don't hear about the word empire so much in this country, unlike abroad where U.S. and empire are becoming synonymous terms. There is a stated ambition to fight multiple overlapping wars and to ensure that all major and emerging powers are integrated as constructive actors and stakeholders into the international system. That is U.S. policy. The report goes on to say that the U.S. will, quote, "also seek to ensure that no foreign power can dictate terms of regional or global security. It will attempt to dissuade any military competitor from developing disruptive or other capabilities that could enable regional hegemony or hostile action against the U.S. or other friendly countries. And it will seek to deter aggression or coercion. Should deterrence fail, the U.S. would deny a hostile power its strategic and operational objectives." So again, General Pace, when asked how he felt things were going in Iraq, I'd say they're going well. I wouldn't put a great big smiley face on it, but I would say they're going very, very well from everything that you look at. As citizens of the empire, I think that it's time for each of us to decide for what it is that we can live with. Can we sleep at night knowing what's being carried out, that we're funding, what's being carried out abroad in Iraq and soon to be probably another country in the Middle East? We're paying for it, we're supporting it, whether we like it or not, by living here. And this now with Iran and very much so in the crosshairs, I think it's a very urgent thing coming up that is most likely going to happen prior to the November elections, short of some drastic action taking here at home. So I think it's an important time for everyone to think about, is this okay with me? Do I support this as a U.S. citizen? And if not, what are we willing to do about it? Thanks. So fire away. Yes, ma'am.
What news sources do you recommend?
What news sources do I recommend? I'll repeat the questions. There's several just right off the top of my head. While none of these are perfect, but all of these are, I think, better than any of the mainstream sources in the U.S., but the Independent newspaper out of the U.K., and all of this is easy to find on the internet. The Guardian, Al Jazeera, they have an English website. There's also another, a really interesting thing, if you don't mind paying a few dollars, it's called MideastWire.com, and it's a collection of editors in the Middle East where daily they translate all of the main stories in every country in the Middle East, and that's a very, very valuable news site. So just to name a few, and then of course back here in the U.S., Democracy Now! Is a good daily news source, and Pacifica radio outlets and things like this. But it's if it weren't for the internet, we'd be in big trouble. But certainly it's easy to find some of these news sources in Europe and even some of them out of the Middle East that are doing a much better job than most of the sources here.
As your perspective as someone that has really been, where all this fighting is happening, and then seeing American sentiment and generally the opinion, and I say a lot of the apathy of America right now, what do you think would be a great step for, I guess, us all to do something about this? What do you think would be a good step for us to start actually combating this, or doing some kind of action where we could, unify or at least take a step forward in the direction of peace as opposed to this debacle?
Oh, I hate that question. I don't know. I can't tell people, well, go to Iraq, get a journal and go to Iraq. But I think there's a lot of stuff, just from my perspective, I still continue to think that information, this is essentially an information war, and that it's about suppression of real information. And I think that organizing people to write letters to the editor of a local newspaper if they're not doing the kind of coverage you think that they should be, or if there's a story that you want to bring to their attention, organizing groups of people to do that, to put leverage pressure on media to do a better job or to change the job that they've been doing. So there's that. Beyond that, I think it's a time that each person needs to just the fact just to ask question, what is there I can do, and to get active in just being a citizen, because as a democracy, there's this crazy thing in this country. If we're supposed to be a democracy, that means we're in charge, not just we're subservient to whatever the powers that be tell us to do. That people have it flipped around. The reality is those people are working for us, and if we don't like what they're doing, then it's our responsibility to change it. And I think that's kind of the overall model of democracy we're supposed to be in. So whether it's getting involved in trying to pick up the fight to demand better information, or just getting politically active locally, I don't know. I don't really know what to tell people. I mean, because I hadn't done much political activism. I'm certainly not an organizer. I basically just got fed up and decided it was time to do something a little bit more drastic than the usual means of expressing dissent. And so I went and started reporting. And ironically now, kind of like the George Orwell quote, telling the truth in times of universal deceit is a revolutionary act. And not that that's I don't know. It's really, I think the information thing is the fight that I've chosen up to take. But I think that it's really up to each person to really think, individually, what can I do and what are my interests and where do I think I can make a little bit of difference. But I think that's a question that everyone needs to be asking right now.
Could you talk a little bit about the insurgency? I just kept thinking that they were a focus group, and then there's a new book out of a man who was saying, they're like 25 or 50 group of insurgents, that they're all little pockets of them too. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, the Iraqi resistance, it's extremely complex. For starters, we have to differentiate between a legitimate Iraqi resistance, which are comprised of numerous groups. There's nationalists, some are Baathists, this kind of thing. But then there's also a growing segment now that is just people who are doing it for economic reasons. Since unemployment's still well over 50%, there's people who are joining, well, I can get paid $500 to go help plant a roadside bomb, so I'm going to do it. So there's that aspect. But yeah, I've heard estimates of up to 100 different resistance groups. And it's really a mistake to talk about the Iraqi resistance as one group or even just a collection of groups, because I don't know how familiar you are with the civil war in Lebanon. But in that war alone, and everyone knows how small Lebanon is, and it's particularly Beirut, one city, there was at least 23 different warring groups. Well, Iraq is basically that on steroids. There's certainly terrorism in Iraq now. There's foreign fighters coming in, but even according to the U.S. military, at most 6% of the people launching attacks against the occupation forces are foreigners, and that's according to the U.S. military. So certainly the vast majority of them are Iraqi. A lot of them are ex-military. Paul Bremer did a wonderful thing, kind of help create the foundations of the resistance by disbanding the entire Iraqi military. So you get a bunch of unemployed, pissed off, armed, trained guys, and when things started to go south relatively quick, well, there's your backbone of the resistance, I think you could argue. But it's certainly numerous different groups with numerous different agendas. I interviewed one fellow who's definitely is an Islamist radical, but then I think it's safe to say that the majority of the people fighting are nationalists. But there's so many different groups with so many different agendas. But the one thing they do have in common is they want to launch attacks on the occupiers and kick them out of the country. But for sure there's terrorism now, and for sure there's the other interesting thing that I think we need to pay attention to is the militias, even the Shia militias like Muqtada al-Sadr. I think arguably the most, if not the most, he's certainly the second most powerful Shia cleric in Iraq now, vying for the position with Sistani. But his militia, the Mahdi army, are actively engaged now in launching attacks on the U.S. military and the other troops. Like some of these attacks, like this past week, there was an attack on a foreign convoy, and I think it was 4 Italian soldiers and 1 Romanian were killed. Well, that's in the south, and there's really no Sunni groups are running around in the south anymore. So that's certainly Shia militia. So they're also part of what you would put in that general term of the Iraqi resistance as well. The question is about Iran and basically how much support does the U.S. have if it were to launch an invasion. And I don't see any really support from Europe. I think basically everyone is, from everything I've read and some of my sources there's just not the support whatsoever. I think any U.S. attempt to put together a so-called coalition of the willing like they did for Iraq is I don't know how it could happen. This administration, even just this past week, I think it was Bolton that came out and very clearly said, we're willing to go this alone. So I don't know. It's are they crazy enough to do it alone? I mean, they were crazy enough to do this thing on Iraq based on what's very clearly now, I mean, it couldn't be clearer that it's all based on lies. And I think, again, this is where we go back to the read the Project for the New American Century and read all the military documents in the Joint Vision 2020. And their goal is basically to control the resources of the Middle East and to deepen U.S. power there and continue to project it further. And I think Iran, therefore, is a legitimate target, Syria, Saudi Arabia, perhaps Egypt eventually. But I think, again, short of some radical changes here and the resistance here in the so-called anti-war movement here, I really don't see them not doing that unless basically these groups opposing it here really start to get their act together.
I'm curious about the permanent bases in Iraq. It's a strategic insanity to think that you can have bases like that and a giant embassy like that in a country where you aren't welcome. Anybody with a mortar, artillery piece, or a Katyusha can make your position there completely untenable. Everybody in the military has to know that. What on earth does the military think about this stupidity? And is there any sort of underlying disgruntlement in the U.S. military the way there was over Vietnam? Is that developing?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually, we're seeing that. I mean, I think it's at least 6 generals now, if not more, have come out. And, of course, they're all retired at this point.
The field grade officers, the majors, the lieutenant colonels, the colonels, are they getting pissed off and leaving?
No. But what I've seen, I mean, just again, I'll go with U.S. military statistics. The most recent, I think, famous poll was there was a Zogby poll that found that 72% of all the troops in Iraq felt that they should be withdrawn within a year. As far as morale, the most recent statistic I saw, the U.S. military conducted itself, the Army did, they surveyed all the units in Iraq, and they found that 56% of them reported either low or very low morale. 1/3 of all the people coming home and finishing their duties and being let go have severe mental disorders 3 to 4 months after they come back home. So morale is low. Troops are not believing in the mission. They don't know why they're there, and that's what I've seen on the ground there too. That consistently, I mean, granted, my first trip was about 7 months into the occupation, so I was still running into a lot of people that this was their first tour. That if they didn't come in with the invasion, they were then being sent in. And consistently, what I saw is if I talked to these people within their first few months, they were kind of gung ho and they were trying to, we're happy to talk to you, and this is our mission, and we're here to liberate the Iraqi people. But then from about 4 months on, morale pretty much steadily went down. And then from 6 months on, I would run into people that were high and being openly abusive to people, right, even though they knew we were journalists. I mean, doing it literally in front of our faces. So kind of that Vietnam effect happening too. But there have been some instances of fragging like we saw during Vietnam, but I haven't seen it being very widespread. There's been a couple of different times I've seen where units have refused orders because they've had bad equipment or no armor on their Humvees or this sort of thing. But for sure, morale is low. People are not happy that they're there. They want to get the hell out. And they continue to this day to be under-equipped. Regularly, we would see Humvees where they didn't have armor, so soldiers would take their flak jackets or extra flak jackets where they could find them and duct taping them along the sides of the Humvees and this kind of thing, and putting sandbags in the floors. The bottoms of Humvees aren't armored, unlike tanks, so they'd put sandbags in the floor so they'd have a little extra protection if they run over a bomb. So, all this translates into bad morale, and a lot of these guys are coming back and starting to talk more openly to try to bring an end to it or some kind of change. So they're talking real openly about some of the atrocities that either they've committed themselves or they've seen people commit as well. Some of these guys, like, for example, in Iraq Veterans Against the War. Yeah, in the back.
I'm just trying to wonder, you were there, is anything positive happening? Something. Is a democracy like a little seed somewhere?
I looked, I honestly did. And at one point, I remember was in a room with a couple other journalists, and I just, hey, I asked them, have you guys seen anything? Because I'm just not finding anything. And they said no. I mean, there's really, of those of us who actually go out on the streets and see stuff and talk to Iraqis firsthand, no, there's just not anything really good to report. I've kind of joked about it at times, and kind of in a weblog written about some of the press releases coming out of the Coalition Provisional Authority at the time, and that sort of thing, about how, one of their good news points was that they managed to get some women in a village to sew together about 200 soccer balls with I love the occupation on them or something to this effect, and then distribute them to give them the soldiers to distribute to kids in Ramadi. I mean, that was basically one of their good news bits. And there are instances where the U.S. military, the Corps of Engineers, will rebuild a school or be engaged in a irrigation project or something like that. So there are these minor reconstruction projects going on, but that's hearts and minds stuff. That's not like the billions of dollars that are, it's not even their job to rehabilitate the infrastructure. I mean, that's part of their kind of military planning. So there are these tiny little incidents of a school here, a school there, maybe a health clinic there. But no, overall, it's really a disaster. That's really a hard thing to portray to people here is, can you imagine if all of a sudden, and it's impossible because, the U.S., this all-powerful military empire, the most powerful military ever to be on the planet, to imagine that we would be invaded and, the country comes in and takes out our government completely. So there's no state, and all of our infrastructure, looting goes on and everything just goes to hell. And so, it's hard to imagine that there's, no security. I could just kill you right now and there's not a thing that's going to happen to me. And, that's daily life now in Baghdad. And it's really impossible to completely convey that to people here until you go there and realize that, just walking down the street, I might be killed or kidnapped any second. And that's life now in Baghdad. And that's what infuriates me, to see the media not showing that daily, that this is what the U.S. has caused there, and that they basically have created a situation where there's basically an Islamic pro-Iranian government. Imagine what women's rights have gone to since this has occurred, let alone just the infrastructure stuff. So it's really that's kind of my very long-winded version that no, I really haven't seen anything positive that's come out of it so far. Yes, sir.
Backing up a minute to your comments about the opposition here in the U.S., you were somewhat heartened by the 6 generals, I guess. I don't have quite as much optimism about that. As I listen to some of them being interviewed, there's at least a few of them who are disgruntled that we didn't send more troops, okay, or that they're blaming the administration because we didn't win this, and if we had just strategically gone about this different, we would be the victors, and things would have turned out better. I wonder how much of that sentiment you sense, in the U.S. population or among the troops, or just what is the true opposition to the secretaries of defense and to the war?
You mean just amongst? I'm not sure I'm super clear on your question.
So I guess my fear is that as we see some of this opposition, I think back to Vietnam, and there's certainly a growing widespread opposition to Vietnam as well. But there was a core of very unhappy people about losing Vietnam that seemed to remain in the population here, and certainly reared its head during the Kerry campaign, with the swift boats and whatnot. And I guess I'm just trying to make the point that I don't know that we can read the opposition as anything that's clearly moral in the sense of being anti-war.
Well, one thing that's an interesting, maybe this will answer your question, maybe not, but one thing that's interesting is, for example, I've been invited on some Fox radio programs, and I did a pretty in-depth story on the permanent bases a ways back, which is a lot of the information I talked about tonight. And I was going to be invited on, and I was talking to this producer, and I said, so they want to argue that like there's not military bases there? I'm more than happy to talk about it. If you want to pick up that debate, I can go there. And they said, no, basically the host is thinks there should be, and they should be even bigger and more of them. And I declined, because it's like, okay, well, it's good to know that's what you guys are thinking, but I don't know. I mean, there's obviously that's the plan, and there's people backing it on that side, but it's total lunacy. And I think the bottom line is it in the best interest of this country? Is it really helping U.S. citizens stay safe? Is it really helping the people of Iraq to have permanent bases there, or more or less troops? And I think across the board, if you look at it logically, absolutely not. It's not helping the situation at all. But as far as opposition, I don't really see. I mean, morale is very low with troops, but I just haven't seen any sort of a GI movement like we saw in Vietnam or something like that. And I don't really know what it would take for that to happen or why that's not happening more. But one big aspect, one thing I should mention is that another thing contributing big to troop morale, low troop morale, is private mercenaries, so-called security contractors working in Iraq. There's at least 20,000 working there, and they're being paid an average of between $500 and $1,500 a day. Basically, they don't have to operate under the military rules of engagement, so they're doing a lot of the dirty work. These are all a lot of them are ex-Army guys or ex-Special Forces people or this kind of thing, but they're not just American either. You've got guys from Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Australia, Nepal, I mean, all around the globe, Colombia. I mean, you pick a country, basically, these people are there. If you're willing to assume the risk, you're going to go over there and make a whole lot of money if you make it out alive. But these guys are running around, and there's actually been instances of U.S. soldiers. I remember one specifically that happened in Fallujah where and these guys are basically cowboys. I mean, not all of them, but I think the majority of them are just running around shooting guns. There's been some videos that have come out of them literally just driving around shooting out their cars like it's some sort of a game. But there was a confrontation between U.S. Marines in Fallujah this past fall, where these guys were riding around in Fallujah in one of their white armored SUVs shooting at people, and they accidentally shot nearby some of these U.S. Marines that were standing there. So the Marines went and got these, I think there were 4 of them, don't quote me on that, but 4 or 5 of them. They got them and basically incarcerated them and roughed them up a bit and had them shipped out of the country, because soldiers are not happy to be making an average of $30,000 or $40,000 a year working alongside someone making, 5-10 times that amount, and they're not having to adhere to any of the guidelines that the soldiers are. So that's another big problem too. Yeah, in the yellow shirt.
Did you hear this report, or is there any truth to it, that the U.S. military has never actually been able to secure the city center of Fallujah?
No, that's absolutely true. I want to point out something. If you go, I think one of the best websites I've seen that tracks U.S. coalition casualties is iCasualties.org. And if you look even at the military press releases, anytime a soldier gets killed in Fallujah, they'll just put Al-Anbar province. If they're killed anywhere else, they'll put a specific city, like the closest city where there's a Ramadi or whatever, but it's in Fallujah. And my point is that U.S. soldiers have been killed, I'd say in the last 6 months, just about every single week, U.S. soldiers are being killed and wounded inside Fallujah. They have not had total control of all of the city at the same time since ever. I mean, certainly not since the November siege was launched. To this day, there's entire neighborhoods that still don't have electricity or water. So despite these draconian security measures, there's been almost no reconstruction in the city. And a big part of that is because the resistance continues to control it, and U.S. soldiers being attacked there or nearby there daily, actually, in Fallujah. And there's basically a media blackout because almost nobody can get into Fallujah. And another thing that reminds me of is the U.S. base. Even just this past week, there's a U.S. base right on the outskirts of Fallujah. It was mortared several times. And even these big military bases, even the green zone, are being mortared almost every single day. When I was there, for example, and the green zone is supposedly the most secure area in the whole country, which is why they call it the green zone. And when I was there in November, December 04, and then January 05, in Baghdad, I was probably about 6 blocks from one of the perimeters of the green zone. And I bet there were maybe 3 days in all those months that the green zone didn't take at least one mortar. So, and that's the case on basically all these U.S. and British bases in Iraq now, that they're being mortared almost every single day. And in Fallujah, they don't have control. That's another thing I want to make real clear. And when you fly in and out of Baghdad airport, for example, in Vietnam, the forces could only secure perimeters of an air base or an army base. So outside that perimeter, they didn't have control. So planes had to do corkscrew descents in a sense. Well, that's happening in Baghdad now. Every time I've flown in and out of there, it's quite the journey, coming in to about 10,000 feet, and then you dip a wing and basically just do that straight down to the airport and take off the same way, because they just don't have control outside of the perimeters of these areas. And that's the way it is, and Fallujah is a pretty extreme example of that. Yeah.
Can you comment on the level of support of the Iraqi people for the original invasion? That per se, as opposed to all the aftermath that has happened afterwards?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of the people of Iraq supported having Saddam Hussein removed. Without a doubt, and I think the first 4, 5, 6 months, it was pretty easy to find people that were pretty happy that not necessarily that there was going to be a permanent occupation, because at that time people still thought it was going to be temporary, but they were very happy to have him removed. There's no question, especially the Kurds and especially the majority of the Shia, and even a lot of the Sunni for that matter. But over time, as things went south, that changed radically. And there was even a poll commissioned by the British military that came out last October 24th, that found that 82% of Iraqis wanted the occupation over immediately, and that less than 1% felt that they were having any security provided whatsoever for them by being occupied. So things changed radically and very, very quickly. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, assuming that the Bush plan for Iran goes through, what do people in the military think about all of a sudden having to face the Iranian army and everybody in Iran who wants to pick up an AK and go across the border in Iraq? Aren't they worried about becoming, the Iranians say that it's going to be, we don't have to worry about an attack because we've got 150,000 American hostages in Iraq.
Yeah, and there's a lot of truth to that, actually, but I think that's a big reason why even high-ranking people in the military now are vehemently opposed to anything related to a direct attack on Iran. But we saw that again before Iraq. We had some high-ranking people in the military that were adamantly opposed either to the timing or the method or even doing it at all. So again, I think we see a repeat of that. But it's an important point, because another just layer of the lunacy of even contemplating an attack on Iran at this point is that all the soldiers in Iraq right now will certainly be in big trouble. For example, the biggest militia is
the soldiers in Afghanistan. Let's not forget them too.
The biggest militia in Iraq is the Dahr organization, which is a Shia Iranian militia. They're Iranian funded, armed, and trained, and they came into Iraq only on the heels of the occupiers. And so these are the people, they're the Wolf Brigades and the death squads. The majority of them are of the Dahr organization. Well, as soon as the U.S. attacks, if the U.S. attacks Iran, those people are going to start fighting immediately against the U.S. forces there. And the other aspect of that is Muqtada al-Sadr, who has a very huge militia. They're not exactly really well trained militarily, but he has a massive militia, the Mahdi army. And he announced from Tehran, actually, on one of his visits there, that if Iran's attacked, that his militia will help defend Iran, both in Iran and in Iraq. So I think immediately the consequences of a U.S. attack on Iran are dire that experts within the U.S. intelligence have said that South Iraq will basically light up like a candle. And then we can talk about Egypt and Lebanon and what's going to happen to Israel. I mean, go on down the line, the whole region will basically go into meltdown if that happens. Yes, sir.
Have you heard any reports of like CIA funding of the insurgency or sort of a pressure from below funding terrorist attacks in Iraq?
Yeah, there's actually been a couple of very clear documented instances. One, the most recent was I think less than 2 months after the bombing of the Shrine of Al-Askariya in Samarra on February 22nd into Crete. This was reported in Arab media outlets that there was an unmarked car of 2 Western so-called security contractors pulled over into Crete. Again, they were found with explosives and this sort of thing. And then if we look back further down in Basra, last year, I think this was roughly 6, 8, maybe 9 months ago, there was a car with 2 British SAS officers that was caught by Iraqi security forces. They were undercover. They were wearing the Arab gown, the dishdasha, and they had grown mustaches and tried to look as local as they could. They were in an unmarked car. They were caught with explosive devices and remote detonators. They were put in jail, and they were accused of basically trying to plant explosives at mosques to generate sectarian divide in Iraq. Well, before they could be tried, and they were going to be tried for that, before they could be tried, the British raised the jail. They attacked the jail with bulldozers and tanks and helicopters, and they got their 2 guys out and freed another 75 guys that were there too. But they got their 2 guys out before they could be tried, and from that point on, needless to say, things have been a bit strained between the British military down in the south and the locals. And it's another reason why there's so many attacks going off against the Brits down there now. But certainly there are these types of, those are the 2 hard examples I can point to. And I'm glad that those have come up, because long before either of those happened, we all knew that this sort of thing was happening, but nobody could point to anything that would prove it. But those are 2, even the BBC reported on the latter one of those that I talked about. Of course, they didn't talk about the accusations that were leveled from the Iraqis at these SAS guys, but they certainly covered the fact that the Brits, a big string of attacks occurred against the British after that happened too, and particularly after what they did at the jail. But yeah, these sort of covert and black operations are...
Can I give this to something we did just check out?
All right, thanks. Yeah, I'll take a couple more.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What are your comments about rumors that Iran actually are supporting the Shia militias in Iraq, and also like allowing the Badr, what's it called?
Badr organization.
Badr battalion
Uh-huh.
across the Iraq?
Well, certainly the Badr organization is under the control of SCIRI, of Syria, of Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, and that is essentially taking its marching orders at the end of the day from Iran. I mean, they're basically the armed wing of that party, the Badr is, and then Sistani, of course, down in Najaf, he is originally from Iran. There's very, very clear links between that militia and then in Iran, and then we see Muqtada al-Sadr, who, while he doesn't, I don't think he's like having his strings pulled from Iran, but he's very clearly expressed that, you know, at the end of the day, when the bombs start falling on Iran, that he's going to line up to fight alongside Iran, whatever that means, whether it's the Iranian army or the Badr. So there's that as well. And then I don't know if you meant to allude to this or not, but, you know, recently also Iran's been accused of launching some incursions into Iraq. The Iraqi government's accused them, or someone in the government's accused them of launching incursions into northern Iraq to fight against Kurdish rebels, just like we've seen Turkey doing the same thing recently. Turkey has over 200,000 troops right now on the border of Iraq, and they're building that up because Kurdish rebels from the PKK have been launching incursions into Turkey. And it was even reported last week that Turkey pushed about 5 kilometers into Kurdistan and were shelling Kurdish positions in Iraq. So, of course, the U.S. is saying, no, please stay out of Iraq, but then not doing anything to address the Kurdish rebel problem. So, you know, it's just another example of how out of control the situation's really become. I'll take one last one, and then, yeah.
So you know, as you said, the plan for this was written years ago, and now it's coming through. Is it for oil? Is it because we've got a born-again Christian president who really is a religious one? What's the plan? I mean, what was
Well, I think it's really clear that it's, and this is even lined out and specifically noted, for example, in the Project for the New American Century. Read it. PNAC, go to the project. It's projectforthenewamericancentury.org. Go there and read it. I mean, it's really, really clear. Specifically mentions the Middle East and Persian Gulf oil and this sort. So I think it's control of resources. It's getting control of, and not just Iraq, but eventually Iran, and I think eventually Saudi Arabia, before other potential superpowers like China or Russia get to those. And it's basically establishing, I mean, the U.S. now, if you look at it geostrategically, they've surrounded Iran. I mean, they've got 4 massive bases in Afghanistan that just happen to fall along the line of a proposed pipeline. They've got, of course, Iraq. They've already been using bases in Iraq to project their military power deeper into the Middle East, not just into Iran. There's special ops going on the ground in Iran right now. But they've, for example, a good ways back, there was a large U.S. military helicopter shot down in Afghanistan, and about 16 troops died. I think it was one of the larger single incidences of U.S. troop death to have happened there. I can't remember exactly when it was, maybe 9-10 months ago, roughly. But that helicopter originated from a base in Mosul in northern Iraq, which means, of course, the only way to get from that base to Afghanistan is to fly over over Iran under the radar, of course. So that's already what they're doing right now. That just a few things that we know of, but I think it's, you know, control of dwindling resources, and it's to establish essentially a military beachhead there in the Middle East, because their plans, they line them out. You know, Iran is probably going to be next, but it's probably not going to be the last one either if they have their way, because, you know, oil is becoming more and more scarce, demand is going up, China's coming online, that sort of thing. So I think all of these factor in together to show that it's certainly about control of resources and really deepening military control and access to where those are, where the ports are, and where the pipelines are going to go. So thanks everyone very much for coming tonight.